I'm Mildred Warner. I'm really pleased to be here, and I thank the Municipal Services Project for inviting me and allowing me to present with you today. I'm going to take things to a different scale. So Julieta started us out with a focus at the firm level, and how does a re-municipalized firm behave, and does it behave any differently, particularly in terms of reaching out for increasing access. And then Susan took us up to the level of the nation and said, you know, what's going on with respect to a reverse price process in the context of a new regime. And I'm going to take us back to the level of the municipality. And I'm not going to focus just on water. And I'm going to give it more of a managerialist turn, not so much a political one. And in that sense, I'm more like Julieta, because she was also looking at management inside the firm and how it's reaching out. I'm going to look at management inside the city. And I'm going to use the term insourcing, because this term re-municipalization is a relatively new term. Insourcing is very common. It's done in the private sector. It's done in the public sector. It's been going on for decades. It's not new. And David McDonald offered this sort of in an email to me. He said, you know, you're talking about reverse privatization in the heartland of capitalism. And I thought, actually, that's a better title, because it's kind of fun. And it's kind of interesting because reverse privatization has been going on in the United States for decades, and it's equal to the levels of new contracting now. So what I wanted to say, what I want to talk a little bit about is this speaks to the limits of the outsourcing revolution. So in the private sector, there was this huge move toward outsourcing as part of the global production chain. And what we're now seeing is that the private sector is insourcing. And the reason why it's bringing its work back in-house is because of problems with control, internal knowledge about production processes that you can't give away to somebody else, increased risk because you're putting the service out to someone else and you're not in control, real problems with service quality, and the lack of cost savings. Now, with public sector insourcing, all of those things are also reasons for why you bring work back. But there are additional drivers, and these are that the public sector itself has improved its service delivery processes. Actually, expenditures in the United States are flat in real terms over the last decade by local governments, and the service quality has not diminished, and a lot of them have kept the same number of services, so they've actually improved their efficiency. There's real concern with citizen access, which is certainly what we saw in the Argentine case. But what we're seeing with the privatization is the exclusion. We had 100% coverage, and with privatization we see poorer neighborhoods or more expensive neighborhoods to serve being cut from the service because they're not profitable to serve. So as city managers have seen the loss of access due to privatization, that's part of what's driven their reversals. And then there's been real problems with public oversight and citizen engagement in the process, because one of the things that privatization does is it protects the private right to profit and the private right to privacy, because privacy is part of where the profit comes from. You don't tell other people how you're doing things. Whereas in the United States, we have an open government law that requires that government processes be open to scrutiny and review by citizens. And it turns out when you privatize, you can't maintain that open government procedure in the privatized service. So why do you reverse? Another big reason for reversing is there's no cost savings. And we actually, just so you know, we did a study of looking at every published academic study in water and garbage collection from around the world, and did a study as to where do you find cost savings and when do you not. And basically, there's no statistical support for saying that privatization results in lower cost. And the reasons are is because there's no competition. You're basically substituting a private monopoly for a public one. These services are natural monopolies, and private owners have an incentive to cut quality to raise profits. So if you don't have strong regulation to ensure service quality, you're going to get the cost savings will come as a result of lower service quality, not actual any efficiencies. So this has led to an issue in Europe of a renewed recognition of the importance of managing a monopoly rather than trying to create a market. Now in the United States, we don't believe in state-owned enterprise, and so we don't look at the managing monopoly approach. We look at the managing market approach. So what's happening is that local governments are saying it's really difficult to manage a market, so we're not going to go to a private market, we're going to go to a public market. And the public market we're going to is another government, a neighboring municipality. Now y'all come up with another new name called PUPs, public-public partnerships. But intermunicipal cooperation is what we call it, and we've been doing it for decades. And it is now bigger than for-profit privatization. It is the new reform. And local governments across the country are cooperating with each other to gain scale, to try to get more technical with the service, to equalize service provision across the region. But it's based on cooperation, not competition, as its core principle. And it's more stable than privatization, and it ensures that you have continuing public control. Unions were, labor was more opposed to this at the beginning. It's now finally come on board. Another way that you manage markets is, again, in the European case, they're more likely to use mixed firms. So you're seeing the emergence of these hybrid public-private firms. So they're not public firms, they're a mixture of the two with shared management. So the idea that this control problem you address inside the boardroom rather than just through the regulatory process. The other reason why you go with these mixed firms in the European case is to get labor flexibility so that you can more effectively shed labor, and that's a big piece of what the mixed firms are about. On the mixed markets, which is more of the US approach, what we see is public delivery and contracting in the same service area, in the same city, at the same time. So you might turn your garbage collection into sectors of the city and contract out 1 or 2 sectors and keep another 2 or 3 sectors in-house. What does that do for you? It allows you to benchmark public and private performance. You actually know the cost of delivering the service because you're in it, and you can assess what's going on with your private contractors. And it gives you a way, knowledge and control over what they're doing. But in the private sector, when they talk about doing this concurrent sourcing, plural sourcing, mixed contracting and in-house and contracted service, they talk about the need to capture market complementarities. So maybe there's somebody who's got a specialty in one particular aspect that you're trying to do. I guess the example here might be water meters. You might bring in a private partner who's got expertise on water meters because you as a government want to extract more user payments from your citizens. You know, that would be an example of a complementarity, I suppose, that Cape Town might explore. But the idea is that maybe there are benefits you can gain, but they're only in particular areas, and so you're looking to manage them. When you do these mixed markets, you're also able to ensure some citizen scrutiny over the process, at least on the public side of it. So what I have to speak from here is US trends data. So these aren't case studies, these are very large samples of all cities and counties in the United States, over 2,500. So the really tiny rural villages aren't here. But we're talking about a sample of between 1,500 and 2,000 governments. And what we did is we combined the ones who answered the survey in years to get a measure of these reversals. And that was only 523, but it's still a large enough group to talk about. And I'm not talking just about water here. The survey measures between 60 and 70 services, and the typical local government provides about 30 of these. And it measures all sorts of forms of alternative service delivery, direct public, of course, being the majority, but then contracting out to for-profits, to non-profits, to other governments, franchises, and volunteers. So what we see is the pendulum's been swinging back and forth. And most services in the United States with local governments are still public, provided directly by public employees entirely and in-house, and they're stable. About 50% of the services that are provided in that way. Contracting has been going on for a long time, for over 100 years in the United States, and many of those contracts are stable. What's interesting is what's happening here at the margin. How much is new contracting going out, and how much is contract reversals coming back in? And they're equal. About the same amounts going out as coming back in. 5 years ago, the same thing. Same amount coming out as going in. 15 years ago, there was more coming back in than going out. And 20 years ago, there was more going out than coming back in. So there was this little privatization revolution in the early 90s. They tried it, it didn't work that well, and then they brought more back in, and now they're just sitting here playing. So one community will go out with its garbage and another one will come back in. It works for one, they stay out. Doesn't work for the other, they come back in. So we decided to look at this stable contracts and stable public. Let's leave them to the side for a minute and let's look at what's going on here at the margin. So you have this new outsourcing and the new insourcing are both equal. But what's interesting is the partner here. On the new outsourcing, half of it is to other governments. So this is public to public contracting, not public to private. And on the new insourcing, the bringing contracts back, the majority of those contracts are coming back from the for-profit partners, not from your other government partners. So the instability in your contracting is coming from the for-profit as your partner. Let's look inside the stable contracts now and what's going on there. So the stable contracts where you have mixed delivery with public and private both in there at the same time, those are more likely to go to for-profit providers because the managers feel like you have to be able to manage these guys, you have to understand what's going on, you have to have information, and the only way to really get that is to be in the game. For the stable complete contracts, this is where you totally contract out and you're not in the game. It's not a mixed case. In this case, I've given all of my service to a partner. If I'm going to do that, I'm primarily going to do that with another government. Because when I do it with another government, public rules still apply. Public labor rules, public scrutiny rules. I have more control, I have more surety, and hopefully that other government will care as much about public values of serving citizens as I do. So that's the idea. So why do you reverse privatize? We asked them, and of course the main reason here at the bottom is there's no cost savings. And the second big reason is the service quality is not good enough. And this is consistent. We have these answers since 2002, every 5 years, and these are always the top two reasons. Political support to bring the service back is always really close down to the bottom. So all this discussion about politics, while it may be important for Bolivia, it's not important in the US. It's really a managerial decision about cost-saving, service quality, and local government efficiency improving. That's what's driving this. I've also run regression models on this, and the level of collective bargaining in the labor force doesn't matter. It's really a managerial decision. So in that context, you have an ally here in your city manager who actually wants to deliver a decent service. The problem is, now let's move up a scale, and I'm going to move up to the national and international scale, where we have a different game going on. And with austerity, structural adjustment is now coming to the United States and to Europe. We've been visiting it on the rest of the world for a long time, and now we get our just desserts. But with that, what's happening is we're having a forced privatization visited upon us by national and international policy. In the United States, there isn't as much control over local government, but what's happening is states are forcing local governments into austerity. Obama cuts funds from the federal to the states cut funds from states to localities. That puts localities into fiscal stress, threat of bankruptcy. The state then imposes a fiscal control board who basically sidelines the mayor and the council, and the fiscal control board runs everything, and ultimately a bankruptcy court decides. That's where we're headed. In the EU, it's much more sinister. This is one time when I'm glad I'm not in Europe. Because the EU has replaced the whole notion of public services with a new term called services of general economic interest, and for these services, competition is the new default. This opens the door to privatization, and even though privatization is not supposed to be preferred by the European Commission, they're actually forcing it in the periphery, led by Germany, which is one of the cities you profiled in your remunicipalization. So you really need to think about what's happening, who's writing the rules, and why they're writing them. And then it gets even more sinister because the free trade rules, NAFTA, which was started in the US under Clinton, which privileges foreign private investors over domestic actors, takes state and local government, have no standing in any dispute, requires you to compensate private investors for any partial taking that a government rule or regulation may make on your profit. These rules, which were first put in place in '94 by Clinton with NAFTA, are now being inserted into the GATS. And my colleagues in Europe always told me that Europe would never do this, but they are, and they're doing it with Canada right now. In fact, Canada's pushing for it, and Obama's pushing for it with the US. And what these rules do is they make local government a non-entity, a non-actor. You're basically, when there's a dispute with a foreign investor, like let's say Bechtel, it's a discussion that happens from the nation state to the foreign investor, and the local government has no voice at all. So here we have a class of local government managers who are actually, from a managerial perspective, willing to reverse their privatizations, are not going to be allowed to by rules being written in Berlin and Paris and Washington. So what are the key questions for future research? I asked, how far will privatization reverse? Well, there's a huge limit here of finance, driven right at the moment by austerity, but also if you've privatized and you actually sold off your assets, which we're now being encouraged to do with public-private partnerships, the cost of getting them back will be exorbitant, and only the richest cities in the world will be able to do so. Then there's the risk management issues and the control issues. So, do we maintain the capacity for reversal? So what I want to get in your mind is that it's a two-way street. It's always been a two-way street. New York City has a 200-year history of privatizing and re-municipalizing its street cleaning service. There's a wonderful history written by Moshe Adler called Been There, Done That. And it's 200 years. This is not new. Y'all can give it a new name if you want, but it's not new. And it was driven by managerial decisions made at the local level. What was the cost? What was the quality? What's happening now with asset sales and the new PPP finance mechanisms is you don't get it right now. Because it's so expensive, you can't possibly afford to bring it back. And that's why this conference hasn't focused at all on finance, and you better, because that's what drives this train. The risk to public values, even with this gain, this market management gain, is that once you're in the market engagement process, it reinforces market values. And that we've talked a lot about here. Cost recovery, financial discipline, and financial discipline as the primary concern over anything about citizen rights and access. Financial discipline trumps, it's first. It's the first order. In a bankruptcy court, it's the first thing. So can we reassert the role of government in regulation, in long-term planning, in democratic engagement? I mean, that's the challenge. And to what extent do these reversals actually do that? And what kind of hybrid forms are going to emerge? And how public are they going to actually be? I think those are really important questions, and I'll leave you with that.